The domain name, also called the URL, is the address of your website. So as you can see for Microsoft, they have a domain name of Microsoft, so the URL would be www.microsoft.com. Now, if you don't already have a domain name, you should think carefully about what sort of domain name you want. From an SEO point of view, if you have your keywords within your domain name, that is going to help. So for instance, let's say in my case, I've got a company and the company name is called Cheltenham Group. Well, I could create a website called cheltenhamgroup.com, but that doesn't tell Google anything about what the company does, or what the product or the services are. So let's say you're thinking of setting up a website for a business that does roof tiling. What you could do is set up the domain name something like rooftilingperth.com or something like that, and that way you have the product or service in the URL as well as a location, which is the best way of doing things. If on the other hand, let's say you've got a company that's been going for years and you've already had a website for years, and you just simply want to create a new version of the website, update it using WordPress, then you're kind of stuck with the domain name you've already got, which might be good, bad or indifferent, but if that's what people are used to, then stick with that. But certainly if you are creating a new website, think about the domain name prior to actually setting everything up. Now, unfortunately, if you want a domain name that reflects your product, services and location, chances are it's probably already been registered. So in the example shown in the slide here, let's say you've got a plumbing company in Perth, then an ideal domain name would be something like plumbersperth.com.au or something like that. Well, that's pretty much guaranteed that will have already gone. So what you could try is reversing the word, so you could have Perth Plumbers, or maybe a slightly different word like perthplumbing.com.au. Sometimes you might need to think carefully about a relevant domain name, URL, and sometimes you might have to go for second best. In some cases you might have to go for a domain name that doesn't really describe what your product or service is. So for instance, a while back I had a client who basically has a holiday home rental in a place called Busselton, which is south of Perth. When we looked at all the appropriate domain names, they all tended to be huge. So you'd have something like holiday home rental house busselton.com.au or something stupid like that. So in that case, what happens is the benefit of having the keywords within the domain name was basically overridden by the fact that Google doesn't like huge long domain names because it tends to think they're a bit spammy. So it's always a trade-off. You want a short domain name that's short and snappy and to the point, describes your product, service, location. But as I say, you also want it as short as possible. In that particular case, where the holiday home was in Busselton, in the end, we decided to go with the name of the house, which was actually a cottage, and we just went with the name of the cottage because that way we ended up with a nice short domain name. It told Google nothing about what the product or service was, but do remember, if you're interested in SEO, then there's about 200 factors that go into the mix, and in some cases you might have to ignore one or two of those factors, in this case the domain name. So domain names and SEO, it is important, as I say, to remember that one of the factors that goes into the SEO mix is the actual domain name. Try and have your keywords and maybe a location inside the domain name if possible. If you do have something about your product, service and location in the domain name, that's great. But if you haven't, then okay. As I say, if you've been stuck with a domain name you've been using for years, then okay, just go with that one. Don't just change it for the sake of it. Now, something else you need to think about is setting up a protected server. You want to use encryption. So traditionally, websites started with HTTP. And these days, certainly if you're setting up a website from scratch, what you want to do is to have a domain name that starts with HTTPS. The S stands for secure. Exactly how you set this up is not important. You can just go to your web hosting company and tell them that if you're setting up a new website, you want it to start with HTTPS. And also, conversely, if you had a website for a while, think about converting it from HTTP to HTTPS. Again, it's just another of those 200 odd SEO factors. Google likes websites that start with HTTPS. It likes secure websites. There is a slight extra cost. Sometimes it costs you up to an extra $100 or something for this, but it's definitely worth thinking about. The other thing you want to think about is registering different variants of your web domain. You don't have to do this, but it's just kind of covering things for the future. So if we take that example where you had a website that you were setting up called plumbersperth.com.au, then you might want to set up a version called Plumber Perth, without the S, and maybe different variations. So instead of plumber, you might have plumbing. You might have them round the other way, so Perth, plumber, etc. You don't want to do this, too many times, because if you get every single variation, it's going to cost you a fair bit of money. But it's just something you might want to think about. It's kind of a way of future-proofing, the competition, if you like, so that if you got a domain name that comes well known, so for instance like plumbersperth.com.au, it will stop anyone else from registering a similar name, assuming that the websites are still available, of course. You will find that with domain names, they're given out on a first come first served basis, so you might find that some are available, some not. So you just need to go to a web hosting company, go and inquire about setting up a domain name, and just see if they're available, see which ones are available. And as I say, the idea of registering different variants is you don't actually have to use them. You just kind of register the domain names and kind of sit on them, if you like. It stops other companies from using those domain names. Do bear in mind they'll have to be renewed sort of every once or 2 years, depending on what sort of domain name it is. But they're actually very cheap. I mean, something like a .com address can be as little as $1, whereas a .com.au, generally they're about $20 for every 2 years, something like that. Something else you might want to consider is buying up international versions of your domain name. So let's say you've got a specific name that's an unusual name. If you're in Australia, you might want to sign up and get the .com.au version. But you might also want to think about registering maybe the UK version, which is a .co.uk, and the international version, which is a .com. And again, it just kind of protects you from, it protects you in the future, as it were. Now, do remember that your domain name needs to be periodically renewed. In most cases, what you can do is you can set up an account with the people you register the domain name with, so that they keep your credit card details on file and automatically renew every year or every 2 years, depending on what sort of domain you have. Do bear in mind that if you do not renew your domain name, they'll give you a certain grace period once the 1 year or 2 year expires if you don't renew. But after a while, it'll go back onto the open market. So, if you do have a domain name, you don't renew it, and then you don't renew it for quite some time, then you'll find that domain name becomes available to anybody else. And if somebody else buys it, that's it. You've just lost it. So, be careful about this one. Now, the other thing you might want to consider is setting up a longer registration period. Generally in Australia with .com.au's, you set them up for 2 years and that's it. You can't, in most cases, you can't sign up for longer than that. But certainly if you're talking about .coms, many companies let you sign up for sort of 5 or even 10 years if you want to. So you can just pay in advance and that's it. It's taken care of. You don't have to worry.